Hi, this is Paul, and this is a Good Place commentary. Now, Michael Schur, in an interview that he did with Vox on a Vox podcast with Ezra Klein, talked about the origins of the show. He was driving in LA traffic, thinking about how people get away with stuff like a dentist cutting traffic, driving up the shoulder, and part of him inside thought, "Boy, I wish there was a moral point system that could take care of something like this." Now, he said he's always had a strong sense of doing the right thing, of following the rules. Now, as a Christian minister, I find his reaction somewhat interesting because it seems as a culture we've spent a great deal of time trying to get rid of guilt and trying to get rid of ideas about right and wrong. And it seems like in the last decade or so, these things have come roaring back. It used to be that we had a sense of there was this authority in the man. He was too demanding and he was always on top of us. And now it seems people are crying out for something to bring order. And so Michael Schur, some of the interviews sounded, they pronounced it Schur. Michael Schur said, I wish there was some kind of accountability system so that when people did this kind of thing, they would be caught and held accountable. And that's the genesis of the show. Now, I've been using movies and TV shows as sermon illustrations for a long time, and about 15 years ago, I used quite a bit of a show called My Name is Earl. My Name is Earl had sort of a similar plot, except it wasn't an afterlife plot. Karma was something that brought order and justice and payback in this world, and karma was kind of the idea. It was a lot looser. Do good things and good things will happen. Do bad things and bad things will happen. Now, this, of course, plays on ideas that come out of India. For India, there are ideas of reincarnation that sort of get unpopular with Americans. For example, there was a Dutch soccer coach that converted to Hinduism and very much imbibed these ideas of reincarnation. And then when there was a discussion in Dutch society about children born with birth defects, the soccer coach basically went on TV and said, any child born with a birth defect is just reincarnated, getting the just desserts from a previous life. And Dutch society had a fit about that. But My Name is Earl kept everything within this realm and tried to picture Earl, who was a very interesting character. You can find the show, I'm sure, on Netflix or some places. And when he did good things happened. When he did bad things happened. But that always raised the question, is it moral to do good in order to get good things? Isn't that sort of a motivation of selfishness? And if you do something good for selfish reasons, does it count? And this very much gets into Michael Schur's point system. The Good Place had accountants, and they tried to evaluate every item according to how much good or how much bad it did into the world. Now, breaking down enormously complex action, and as if you get into subsequent seasons of the show, they'll go into this further, this itself gets tremendously complex because the moral consequence of doing something good, let's say, an example used later in the series of using your smartphone to purchase a dozen roses for grandma, well, did sweatshop labor go into that smartphone? What is the carbon footprint of that smartphone? What is the carbon footprint of those flowers? What is the carbon footprint of on and on and on and on? Very quickly, calculations can be complex, far beyond, well, I thought I was just doing a good thing trying to make grandma happy. In other words, The Good Place is a bit more sophisticated than My Name is Earl. Again, another sitcom that tried to wrestle with these ideas. And of course, the poster child in The Good Places for this is Doug Forsett. Now, in a later episode, they visit Doug Forsett and look at, wow, this is the guy who figured out the moral point system, and he's living his entire life in order to rack up moral points. And so he's very conspicuous about not hurting everyone. He's trying very hard to make people happy. And, well, if you get to later episodes, you'll see how well this works out in Doug Forsett's life. Now, I want to play a little bit of a video from Jordan Peterson. Those who are familiar with my channel will know Jordan Peterson. For some of you, he might be new, and you might have positive or negative ideas about it. I'd ask you to just kind of hold off on your ideas about him and just watch the video. The video, I think some of his best videos are videos of his instruction that he gave to classes at the University of Toronto. And here he's giving a class on trait agreeableness. Agreeableness is one of the big 5 personality traits that psychologists who are focusing on measurement try to figure out what goes into people's behavior. Trait agreeableness is just like it sounds. How agreeable are we? How quickly do we take the price that the salesman offers? How quickly do we accept the idea from the boss that, well, we can't afford to give you a raise right now? Agreeable people tend to value agreement with other people. Now, part of what has happened in American culture is that good has become equated with nice. And that is an issue, and why I picked this, and that's built into the golden rule. For example, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's a wonderful rule. You can find it. Jesus offers it. You can find it in Confucius. You can find it actually in quite a few places around the world. But is it in and of itself sufficient to offer a thoroughgoing morality? And as we get into a little bit later in this video, how does it stack up against love? Now, Jordan Peterson in this video tells a story, and one of the things I really liked about Jordan Peterson's classroom lectures was that they were filled with stories, a lot more than a lot of the book tour lectures that he gave later on in his journey. So let's listen to this, and I think we're going to get some insights into, well, is this morality of being nice or being kind or doing good things to people, does that in fact really good? Is it sufficient to get us where we want to go?
And I'll tell you a story. I have a friend. I gave him my personality test, the Big 5 aspect scale that Colin DeYoung developed in my lab. And I knew he was a disagreeable guy, and by interacting with him. I mean, he's even rude to people sort of spontaneously on the street. I actually like him quite a bit. He's very, very funny. He's also very conscientious, so you can trust him, but he's disagreeable as hell. And so I gave him this test because I thought it would be funny, and he came out as the most disagreeable person in 10,000.
Now, again, when we're looking at morality on this sort of American niceness scale, disagreeableness would be a sin. Disagreeableness, well, we would characterize the guy maybe as a jerk. And so this guy is, the most disagreeable guy you can find in any 10,000 people. So how would we judge his morality?
So reasonable in compassion, about 30th percentile, but like 0.001 in politeness. So he's extraordinarily blunt. He'll just say absolutely anything, no matter how horrible it is. And he was often brought into corporations to sort of clean them up. So if a corporation was tilting and not doing well, they'd bring him in to find out who the useless people were and fire them. And I talked to him about that.
Now again, firing people would seem to be, well, that's a horrible thing to do. People need jobs. Is it moral ever to fire someone? And they bring this guy in because, he's the guy who's going to fire people. He looks around and says, these people aren't contributing, these people aren't contributing. Out they go. Sounds terribly heartless and cruel. But what if the corporation that they're working in is a doctor's office? And what if, in fact, the poor performance of this doctor's office means that people aren't receiving their medication on time, or they're being double billed, or on one hand, we want people to be nice and kind and generous. On the other hand, we want our institutions to be able to work. Well, what does it require for an institution to work? It requires that, someone goes around and keeps things tight in the institution and makes sure that everybody does their jobs. So what is moral?
Because I've had the opportunity to have to not have graduate students in my lab, for example, that weren't performing well, and I'd find it very, very difficult to, dress someone down, and certainly difficult to fire them. I just hate it because I'm actually quite an agreeable person, much to my chagrin.
And now, again, if you only know Jordan Peterson by reputation, that might strike you as odd, because we often see the poor guy in the middle of conflict, and he's high and agreeable, and agreeable people don't like conflict. Well, where is morality in all of this?
And I asked him about that, and I said, well, what do? You have to fire people all the time. How do you handle that? He says, handle it? I enjoy it. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting that someone would have that response. I said, well, what?
Well, is it good that he enjoys firing people? Is that moral? But again, you have to ask, well, let's see. If he's working for the state, if he's working for Medicare, and Medicare isn't delivering good service to how many seniors dependent upon it for their medical treatment, well, then you'd say, no, we want a guy in there who's going to fire people who aren't doing their jobs. And we would rather the world is a happier place if the guy who actually has to fire people actually enjoys firing people, because many of the rest of us who are much more agreeable than that guy wouldn't like it at all. In fact, we would dread it and hate it and avoid it, and on it goes, and it gets worse and worse. And then so, Peterson meets this guy and says, wow, this is fascinating.
What do you mean you enjoy it? He said, look, I go into these companies and I analyze the performance of groups of people, right? And in those groups, there are people who are really striving, really trying hard and working themselves really hard and being productive. And then there's these people that are just doing nothing. They're completely in the way. They don't carry their weight at all. They take advantage every chance they get. And they're always whining about why they can't work. It's like, I find out who they are, I call them into my office, and I tell them exactly what they've been doing. It's like, hit the road, buddy.
Now, when we hear that, part of us, for many of us, enjoys that little scenario. Part of us thinks, wow, that's great. Here's a problem. I'm going to go in, I'm going to address it, I'm going to fix it. Hit the road, buddy. We have a sense of, well, it's vindication. We see a wrong and we've righted it. So again, you can't just say, well, morality is kindness. This guy is firing people right and left, and those who get fired, I'm sure, hate his guts, and he doesn't care. But again, if this is within a system that other people rely on to make the world a better place, well, then we kind of want this guy in the system.
You've had your run of it. And I thought, oh yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, I can tell you, I've had situations in my lab where I had underperforming graduate students, and one of the things that was really awful about that was that it was really hard on the high-performing graduate students, because they felt that even being in the same category as the people who weren't working hard and pulling their weight devalued what they were doing, and that's exactly right. And so this is also why there's a conscientiousness trait and an agreeableness trait.
Okay, right there. You've got a conscientiousness trait, which is, well, this is about following through. This is about keeping my word. This is about, helping the office run as it should. That's very conscientious. And we listen to that and say, that's morality. And agreeableness, doing to others what they want done to them. Kindness, well, that's morality. But here's the problem. Can conscientiousness and agreeableness both actually meet? Aren't they sometimes at odds with each other?
Because conscientious people judge you on your accomplishments, right? They don't give a damn about your feelings, not a bit.
Now, one of the things that you'll notice about The Good Place is it's an individualistic meritocracy. And as Americans in our culture, we like that. We like meritocracy because we like to imagine an objective standard out there that if it is met, the world is right. And we like that because we believe that it inspires people to try to improve and get better and climb the ladder and reach for the stars. And so we like these ideas of self-improvement. So The Good Place is deeply built on a meritocracy. But meritocracies require conscientiousness, and meritocracies are not kind or nice. Meritocracies don't just hand out participation trophies. Meritocracies say that the people who do the best should be rewarded with the best rewards, and those who don't shouldn't. But is it all merely effort that determines our capacity for excellence?
It's like, are you doing the work or not? Whereas agreeable people think, well, you know, your mother's sick and, you know, you've got a bunch of family problems and we all have to take care of each other and it's no wonder that you're having a rough time. And like, you can't say that one of those attitudes is correct and the other isn't correct. You can't say that. There wouldn't be those two dimensions if there wasn't something correct about both of them. But you can certainly point out that often they conflict, you know, and so the demand for inclusiveness and unity and care and the demand for high-level performance in a hierarchical structure, they're very different orientations in the world. And so it's complicated for people who are agreeable and conscientious. And actually, I think often that large corporations, large institutions of any sort run on the unheralded labor of people who are high in agreeableness and high in conscientiousness, and they're disproportionately women. My experience in large institutions has been that if you want to hire someone to exploit appropriately, no, not appropriately, if you want to hire someone to exploit productively, you hire middle-aged women who are hyper-conscientious and who are agreeable, because they'll do everything. They won't take credit for it and they won't complain. And that's nasty, and I think that happens all the time. And so one of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. And I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants.
And off he goes from there. So here's the issue. Well, corporations look for high in conscientiousness, high in agreeable women because, well, he says Peterson's idea is that, well, women are, generally speaking, higher in trait agreeableness because they shouldn't kill the babies. Because a baby, there are few things more demanding than an infant.
And so that just doesn't work so well in that actual world. And one of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, you know, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things...
Morality is coming back in. Say what you think. Tell the truth.
You think are nasty and harsh. And they probably are nasty and harsh. But they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. You know, and you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. You know, and if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you're also maybe loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And, you know, if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges.
And you see right there, well, there's the value of agreeableness. It sounded like agreeableness was a problem. It sounded like agreeableness was a bad thing. First, we thought agreeableness was a great thing because, we love people who are agreeable, people who are kind. And then we learned that agreeable people, they're getting abused. They're getting taken advantage of. That isn't moral, so agreeable people need to stand up. And in terms of traits, women tend to be higher and agreeable than men. Now, again, remember, those are two bell curves, and they're overlapping, but, you know, men tend to be less in, anyway, you can listen to the whole lecture and get that whole spiel. But then we see, well, agreeableness is actually pretty important in the short term. So what we discover is that morality, which is the question of what to do, what should you do, is actually a very difficult thing. Now I'm going to jump to the ultimate example, breaking Godwin's Law, because why not? Would it be good to do things that would make Hitler happy? Doug Forsythe wanted to make everyone happy. And so when we looked at Doug Forsythe, we thought, well, that in itself isn't very good. And what you begin to realize is, well, they have this point system in The Good Place, but it's not just points in terms of being evaluated on good, bad, right, or wrong. If a lot of the things that you would do to make Hitler happy, most of us would declare would be wrong. But we also have this relational pole that we work, and people are caught between these relational poles. And agreeableness is often exactly where these things meet. Because agreeable people will, well, we might think that they're nice and kind. Agreeable people will, via relationships, often get caught doing things that we would otherwise say are wrong. So not only is there agreeableness and conscientious, which are sort of opposing, there's also sort of this universal moral rule-like scale sort of moral thinking that we have. And then there's relationality, relational moral thinking. Treat me as I want to be treated. I will treat you as I want to be treated, and so on and so forth. Now, you might say, well, you're a pastor, and that's why I started watching these videos, because I thought, what would a pastor say about the good place? Well, a pastor will tell you what's in the Bible. Now, a lot of people don't know what's in the Bible because the Bible is very hard to read. And we don't read the Bible in a very organized way. And so people bring a lot of their presuppositions to the Bible. What you will find in the Bible is both this relational sort of rules and also these thought-action rules that seem more universal. People might want to call them objective. So there's thought-action rules like you'll find in the Ten Commandments. The Bible will say, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. But the Bible is not in itself a list of rules. Actually, there are, in terms of, the Bible's a very big book, but most of the Bible is not rules. Most of the Bible is poetry and story and letters. Okay, that's most of the Bible. And so there are a lot of narrative images in the Bible. And again, this is part of what makes The Good Place so powerful, because it's narrative, because it's pictures, because it's stories. And you can embed a tremendous amount of moral intuition within a story. And this is part of the reason that stories have been used to inform and form us morally throughout thousands of years of human history. Now, at one point, someone comes to Jesus and wants to see if he can summarize the law. And this isn't unique to Jesus. This was commonly done in the first century. We have other accounts of other people having similar conversations. And Jesus sums up the law this way: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And in other places, well, who is your neighbor? Well, the person all the way up to and including your enemy. And Jesus will tell you to love your enemy. And this is why kindness sort of falls apart, because any parent will know, anybody in a difficult relationship, let's say with an addict or an alcoholic, will know that love doesn't always mean giving into the other. Agreeableness is a fine thing, but it can't live on its own. It has to live with conscientiousness, and they both live together. And so Jesus says these two things sum up the law. Now, God is a very complex thing, but love God is sort of puts us along the lines of these universal laws of morality that we think of, and love your neighbor. And so they're both sort of bound together. Now, one of the things that you might notice in the Bible too, one of the reasons I like The Good Place is because it actually deals with the good place and the bad place. And I think it's important that it tries to deal with that polarity. Now, the Bible talks about the bad place. Jesus talks about Gehenna. Hades comes up in the New Testament. Gehenna is a Greek word translated as hell often in contemporary English translations. But now one of the things that you find is that a lot of the stories, and Jesus talks about the bad place more than anyone else, and a lot of the times he talks about the bad place in terms of stories. And there are two ways. There are Judgment Day images in the New Testament, and again you'll find statements like people are judged according to what they have done. And so in that sense, it sort of leads us to sort of thinking along the lines of this point system that you have in The Good Place. But there's another whole section of bad place, Judgment Day passages in the New Testament, most of them again by Jesus, that are actually relational. Jesus will say things like, "Depart from me, I never knew you." Jesus never says you didn't score enough points. He says, you didn't recognize me, you didn't know me. So then you have a lot of these bad place passages have shut doors where Jesus says, "Nope, I'm not opening the door," and people are outside where there's darkness and gnashing of teeth. Now, a lot of this boils down actually to a very fundamental question that those who have been following my other videos know is something that I talk a lot about, the question of whether the universe at heart is fundamentally personal or impersonal. Now, many people at this current moment seem to prefer an impersonal model of the universe. An impersonal model of the universe basically says, well, things just are, and we are the moral agents within the universe that will somehow discern the laws of this universe and act accordingly in our own moral self-interest. Now, there are a number of points. There are a lot of twists and turns in this episode, and I'm trying to give at least the first of these videos to do them fairly spoiler-free. So if you watch the series, you'll notice a lot of episodes, and these raise sort of the kinds of questions like, is it moral to damn myself in order to save others? That's a complex system. Now, if the universe is impersonal, it's just laws operating, well, then there are just laws. If the universe is personal, well, then we would hope that, well, maybe in a personal universe, a personal God or a personal judge would see such self-sacrifice and recognize it and, in fact, award points for that effort. In fact, as this show goes on, there's a lot of question about, well, is the point system just? Is the point system fair? Is the whole setup fair? And that, of course, is based on the question of what should the system be about? But as long as you're dealing with an impersonal system, it's all sort of at arm's length. And what's interesting, even in the confines of the show, is that personal agents weigh in to try to change the impersonal system. And this gets again into one of the themes that I develop quite a bit in my videos, which is that persons colonize the impersonal. Persons take control and wield the impersonal. And we have all kinds of ideas about that. It's okay to use machines. It's not okay to use people. We have a great deal more respect to creatures that have agency than those that we don't. Now, why are impersonal conceptions of the universe so popular right now? I think it's because we have trust issues. I think it's because we have a great deal of fear that if at the heart the universe is personal, and if you've ever caught yourself, whether or not you believe in God, talking to the universe or appealing to the universe for mercy or clemency, you will see deep in yourself this instinctive idea to approach the universe as if it's a person. And that's not a bad idea. In fact, I'd say that's actually a very good idea, even if you're an atheist, even if you don't believe in God, even if you believe that the universe is fundamentally impersonal, because, and I get into this in some of my old videos where I talk about Pascal. Pascal had this idea of the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse. We approach machines and impersonal things that we think we have already captured in our minds. We figured out the system with the spirit of geometry. If I do this, this happens. If I do that, that happens. My name is Earl, figure that out. I'm going to do what's morally good, so I get the universe giving me morally good things. It's sort of a morality machine. If I do morally bad things, then the universe will do morally bad things towards myself. What people tend to do, however, if we have a big something in front of us that we can't recognize and don't know how to operate impersonally with the spirit of geometry, then we tend to approach it with the spirit of finesse. We tend to try it out, which is exactly how we deal with other people, because people themselves are enormously complex. So why don't we like to imagine that the universe is fundamentally personal? Because if the universe is personal, we're terribly afraid that it's going to make choices about us that will be unjust. It's going to make choices about us that will be unfair, because all of us have had the experience of dealing with a parent or dealing with a teacher or dealing with a spouse, someone who has a degree of authority, and they make decisions that we believe are unjust. And once, as human beings, we have a conflict of persons, well, then we get a lot of anxiety. And that gets back to the agreeableness thing with Jordan Peterson. One of the interesting things about The Good Place is that not only is the universe in The Good Place impersonal, but the personalities that seem to have a degree of authority and power within the universe are not terribly godlike. And I think this reflects contemporary suspicion about traditional religions such as Christianity, and a lot of people who have decided that they are no longer within the Christian fold. They do so because they've got trust issues, because bad things have happened and the universe seems too chaotic. And for these reasons, we imagine that there's no one in charge. And so when bad things happen, we actually feel better not to imagine someone did it to us, so that we don't take it personally. But there are consequences to that position, and the consequences, in many ways, you see played out in The Good Place. At some point, you'll meet the judge, and the judge is not an all-knowing, all-seeing God. In fact, it's very interesting the ways that The Good Place has sort of split up God in our system, is that in many ways Janet is an everlasting, all-knowing being, but Janet doesn't practice any agency. Janus in some ways embodies an idea by a scholar named Christian Smith, who surveyed people across the religious spectrum and said most Americans have an implicit religion called moralistic therapeutic deism. And moralistic therapeutic deism basically says that the universe is impersonal. Maybe there was a God, but he made it a long time ago. The universe is fundamentally a moral machine, and we should work that moral machine, and that inspires us to a moral meritocracy, but then it's therapeutic. And actually the ideas of moralistic therapeutic deism are deeply embedded within The Good Place. If you're going to make a popular show, you're going to have to embody the moral assumptions of your audience. And so basically Janet is the moralistic therapeutic deist God who gives people whatever they want, whether it's good for them or not. The judge is a completely different character, and I don't want to give any spoilers, but the judge is not all-knowing. The judge does not always render good decisions. In many ways, the judge in The Good Place is the kind of God people have been rebelling against because seems inept, neglectful, and certainly not all that trustworthy, although the judge has tremendous power, more power than Janet in some ways. But Janet, on the other hand, is the moralistic therapeutic deist God. Now, this impersonal or personal universe, there's a very interesting video, talks about the meta-divine realm, which is sort of the impersonal universe where there are laws and rules and agents within that universe that have to operate within it. That's sort of the image of The Good Place, whereas Christianity, classical theism, much more says, monotheism much more says that the universe is fundamentally personal at heart. And I'll leave a link to Christine Kaufman's video and maybe a video of my own in there. One of the things that The Good Place does pick up on well is our agency is conditioned. And so often during the show, they will go back and look at the storylines of the individual characters. And we will often see with sympathy how, they've been dealt a hard hand. And a lot of their moral decisions that have been their poor moral performance has been conditioned by circumstances beyond their control. And this is where we get into this question of morality. That morality in order to judge someone, they have to be real moral agents. And so we see that Eleanor did not have a good mother. Eleanor has personality traits that are partly inherited biologically. How high is Eleanor in agreeableness? She's also got a degree of conscientiousness. She seems fairly low in conscientiousness, fairly high in agreeableness, but not real high, because Eleanor is not above just telling someone exactly what she thinks. Now, this will impact whether or not she can make good choices. And of course, this is part of the complexity of judging people. But it isn't just our individual agency, it's also the morality that is present in our cultures. Because what morality seems to be is also a socially constructed game. We've seen morality change dramatically in the last 100 years, even in a place like the United States. Now, many people imagine it's changed for the better. Other people imagine it's changed for worse. A lot of people imagine that, well, what we really need to do in order to get rid of this problem of changing morality is we should look inside ourselves, because our hearts will be our guide. And this is a tremendously romantic notion, but the notion also has some significant problems. So I want to read a passage out of a book by Timothy Keller on preaching, which illustrates this. There are many severe problems with the sovereign self as a philosophy of life. To begin with, it assumes that we know what we want. And we'll actually find this in the character of Chidi. Chidi often can't decide what is moral, and he can't decide what he wants. It assumes that we know what we want, that our inner desires are coherent and harmonious. Modernity tells you to discover your deepest desires and fulfill them. I think actually that's Romanticism that tells us that. But our deepest desires often contradict one another. C.S. Lewis makes this point in his book, The Abolition of Man, when we say, well, our morals are really only instincts, but how do we know which instinct to fulfill at one time? Is it our instinct for loyalty to our spouse or our God, or is it our instinct for eating food or having sex or rising status by telling a lie and getting ourselves out of a difficult spot? A desire for a stellar career will often be in conflict with the desire for a particular relationship, and our feelings constantly shift. So an identity based on our feelings will be unstable and incoherent. An even more serious problem is that an identity based on expressing ourselves, which again, Robert Bellah, who was a sociologist in the 1980s, wrote a book, Habits of the Heart, which he called Sheilaism, which is sometimes called expressive individualism, which is also something deeply built into the good place. An even more serious problem is that an identity based on expressing ourselves without listening to outside dictates is actually an illusion. A popular exponent of the sovereign self was Gail Sheehy in books like The Seminal Passages in 1976. She insisted that you can become yourself only when you can look inside and express yourself apart from any external evaluations or accreditations. Now, the good place is rather nuanced on this score. You'll find them sometimes appealing to just being yourself, and sometimes to, well, doing the right thing. Because if you're Jason, just being yourself means throwing Molotov cocktails, and that's not always the right thing. Now, Tim Keller continues, imagine an Anglo-Saxon warrior in Britain AD 800. He has two very strong inner impulses and feelings. One is aggression. He loves to smash and kill people when they show him disrespect. Also, as a warrior, I would say, he gains status in his tribe by being aggressive. That's what the tribe is valuing. Living in a shame and honor culture with its warrior ethic, he will identify with that feeling. He will say to himself, that's me. That's who I am. I will express that. And quite frankly, he'll be rewarded and encouraged to do that. The other feeling he senses, let's say, is same-sex attraction. To that he will say, that's not me. I will control and suppress that impulse. Now imagine a young man walking around Manhattan today. He has two inward impulses, both equally strong, both difficult to control. Maybe one would be described as toxic masculinity. That would be the warrior ethos. But that is not currently in fashion in Manhattan today. Tim Keller was a pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Manhattan, so he's very much speaking to and from his own audience. He has the same two impulses, both equally strong, both difficult to control. What would he say? He will look at the aggression and think, this is not who I want to be. I don't want to have toxic masculinity. All of the voices around me are saying, don't encourage that toxic masculinity. And will seek a deliverance in therapy and anger management programs. He will look at his sexual desire, however, and conclude, that is who I am. What does this thought experiment show us? Primarily, it reveals that we do not get our identities simply from within. Rather, we receive some interpretive moral grid, lay it down over our various feelings and impulses, and sift them through it. This grid helps us decide which feelings are me and should be expressed, and which are not and should not be. This grid of interpreted beliefs is not innate, unadulterated, or an expression of our feelings. It shapes our identity. Despite protest to the contrary, we instinctively know our inner depths are insufficient to guide us. As C.S. Lewis says in the Abolition of Man, that the problem with our instincts is that we have so many of them. And it's often the morality that we see being encouraged and rewarded around us, or the immorality, that pushes us to behave one way or another. This is why morality is so difficult to manage and why we find so many different moralities expressed throughout cultures. Where do our Anglo-Saxon warrior and our modern Manhattan man get their grids? From their cultures, their communities, their heroic stories. They are actually not simply choosing to be themselves. They are filtering their feelings, jettisoning some and expressing others. They are choosing to be the selves their culture tells them that they may be, and in fact their parents. In the end, an identity based independently on your own inner feeling is impossible. The reality is that we can no more bestow dignity on ourselves than identity. And this is where the personal or impersonal universe gets very tricky. Because if you have a personal universe, well, you believe the universe is talking to you, you believe the universe is relating to you, well, you're going to do something to try and please the universe. That's even someone with agreeableness harnesses their agreeableness in order to please the universe or to please God. The reality is that we can no more bestow dignity on ourselves than identity. In fact, they go together. In The Need for Recognition, Charles Taylor quotes Gail Sheehy's book and her counsel that we must not care what others think. And again, you might hear those ideas expressed, maybe in the good place, maybe in other places, and you only learn, you hear it expressed other places, don't have toxic masculinity, or rein in your sexual impulses, whichever one is in fashion or out of fashion today. Taylor argues that this too is impossible. You cannot bestow significance on yourself. Stewart looking in the mirror and applauding himself really doesn't get you that far. You cannot get significance through self-recognition. It must come in great measure from others. In the end, you can't name yourself or bless yourself. You can't ultimately say to yourself, I don't care that everyone I know thinks I'm a monster. I love myself, and that is all that matters. People who are low in agreeableness, they have a much easier time at that. When people are high in agreeableness, they can't do it at all. They become basically mirrors of the context that they are in. That would not convince us of our worth unless we are mentally unsound. We need someone from outside to say we are of great worth, and the greater the worth of the person telling us so, this is where God and the universe come in, the more powerful that recognition is to our identity formation. So if we try to authenticate and validate ourselves, we place ourselves in an infinite loop of delusion that will lead to either narcissism or self-loathing. Now, I encourage people to read history. Tom Holland wrote a really fun book called Persian Fire, and one of the things that was interesting about that book was he went into Spartan civilization. And what you see in various civilizations are very different moral matrices. Now, The Good Place very much reflects sort of Hollywood 2020 moral matrix. The lists of good and bad, sort of on the universal objective scale, are according to that culture, what their particular culture is rewarding. And that isn't often set out there. Morality, they don't set arguments for the decisions they're making with respect to morality. They simply assert them. That's very much in keeping with Christian Smith's book. I usually keep it right here. I don't have it right here. Soul searching. Because this is what people are doing, is they are, well, moralistic therapeutic deism. I'm going to reflect the culture around me in order to gain status, in order to be liked. Disagreeable people are going to resist that more, but there'll be other things that they're seeking. So one of the interesting things was his discussion about Spartan civilization. Spartan civilization in some ways is very famous because it was the 300 at Thermopylae that held the gate against the massive Persian army, and we look at that and we esteem that. There's the warrior ethic. Sparta had a high degree of male-female equality. Women had a lot of power in that society, and so we might look back at Spartan culture and say, that's one we should emulate. There was discipline and self-denial and everybody working for the common good. That sounded wonderful. What we don't look at is that, well, the Spartan warrior classes lived off the backs of what they called the helots, which were basically the slaves that worked the field and did a lot of the water carrying and the grunt work that allowed those warriors to be so completely well trained that they would win Olympic awards because all they did was work on their bodies while the helots were doing all the other grunt work. Another aspect, and this is interesting to say compared to Tim Keller's British Anglo-Saxon warrior from 800, well, boys who were being mentored, part of the mentorship negotiation was sexual access to the boys. And that was seen as, they weren't just gay men doing that. They didn't have that category of gay. It was just part of the culture. Is that good? Is that bad? Every human culture seems to be a mixed bag, even from our perception. Now, what we're discovering is that morality is multipolar. We have some scale of right and wrong that seems universal, and we all appeal to that. If you want to read C.S. Lewis's probably most popular book, which is an introduction to Christianity, why can't I think of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity? He begins his argument for the existence of God based on the idea that we all seem to have a sense of universal morality. Now, I hesitate to call it objective because I think that casts it wrong. I think universal morality is a better way of understanding it. We all appeal to some other standard outside of ourselves, even if our standards differ. But we all imagine that the universe is beyond ourselves and not simply a function of human agreement. We don't believe fundamentally that this aspect of morality is democratic. Okay? That's really important. So that's one pole. Another pole is the relationality. We believe that morality is also relational. Morality is also personal. So not only is there sort of this universal, unchanging aspect of morality, there's also a relational, dynamic aspect of morality. And we have both of those. We have people seeking positive communal potential. That's what the guy who is low in agreeableness but high in conscientious does when he goes into a business or a system and says, this system needs to operate maximally for the sake of its purpose. And if the system has a good purpose, such as maybe delivering health care to people, well then it should operate maximally. And if we would find a system that has a good purpose not operating maximally, we would call that an evil. We also believe that people should, they're seeking positive individual potential. Eleanor Shellstrop has a lot of growing to do. And the question is, how can Eleanor grow up? What the show really asks about is not only what is a good person, but what is the environment, the best environment conducive for moral improvement. Okay, that's really what's beneath the show. And quite frankly, given how complex this all is, it's amazing we actually do manage all of this quite intuitively. And we generally do it by intuition and by story. We will tell ourselves story and say, when I look at this story, I can sense it as being good. Now, again, there's a lot of our culture based into that, but we almost always appeal to a moral standard, a universal moral standard that we believe doesn't change and is up above all of us. And The Good Place assumes that such a standard is possible. In fact, that's sort of what its point system is based on. And if you go through the whole series, the series will explore the problematic aspects of the point system. Now, one of the things we need as human beings are wisdom institutions. We have these, again, these four poles, let's call them. The universal, C.S. Lewis calls it the Tao in The Abolition of Man. Relational morality, we have to, what do we owe each other? That plays a very big role in the series. Goals for the communal. What does a good community look like? And again, some of what has interested me about the series is it asks those questions and goes into them at, a fairly deep level, especially for a sitcom, a 22-minute sitcom. And goals for individuals. What should a good person look like? And I think in order to do this, human beings need wisdom institutions. One of my definitions for a good culture is a good culture affords wisdom to people younger than the amount of time they would have needed to develop it themselves. One of the interesting plays of The Good Place is that it begins to deal with time. So all of these people died young on Earth, but really what the story is about is how can time and repetition, and I'll get into other ideas about simulation theories because there's a lot of that under this show, how does time relate to the question of moral improvement individually and communally? And one of the things that they want to, and has been done by various religions, is if you extend the amount of time, well, sometimes people need more time than their little biological life on Earth has afforded them. Maybe they haven't made good use of their time. There's a moral question. And so there are implicit institutions such as parenthood and morality. I just did a video. I do conversations on my channel, and I just did a video with Guy Sengstock, who lives over in the Bay Area, and we began talking about marriage and how marriage is a kind of institution that brings wisdom to people, hopefully, if they submit to it. Same with parenthood. Once you have a child, having the responsibility of having that child will hopefully, maybe not in Eleanor Shellstrop's mother's case, but hopefully lead you to be a better person because you realize what the stakes are, not just for you, but for a child that you love, hopefully. Some institutions are explicit: churches, schools, counselors. We need wisdom institutions in our life to actually spur us on towards working on these questions ourselves. Part of the reason I think we are not doing well as a culture with wisdom right now is that we have so many distractions. We are amusing ourselves rather than actually educating ourselves and disciplining ourselves, which is the kind of work that wisdom institutions do. And so part of me was really delighted to see a program like this because it puts the topics up in the national conversation. Then you have the question of where do we get wisdom? Well, we get wisdom from a variety of places. We see someone or something and it inspires us to reach out towards it, to be like it. I will sometimes get questions from parents about how can they do well raising their children, and I will usually tell them, be the kind of person you want your child to become, because your child will watch you and learn from what you do more than what you say. The old adage, actions speak louder than words. We need something to say no to us, something to limit our desires, something to help us rein them in so that we don't just make a mess of our lives. So this will probably be sort of typical of the kinds of videos I do on The Good Place. I'm going to use the alternative thumbnail on the Good Place videos. Some of you will watch all the videos I make. Some of you pick and choose which videos you watch, and I hope with the thumbnails that are on the YouTube will give you a sense. If you only want to watch the Good Place videos, you can. With my other videos, I go quite a bit deeper into a lot of these issues, and the conversations and the philosophy and the religion can get a little esoteric. So if you like that stuff, you can watch the other videos. If you don't, I'm trying to keep these videos a little bit more accessible. And then there are the conversation videos. In the conversation videos, you'll usually see my face and my conversation partner or multiple partners, and those will be up front in the thumbnail. The Freddie and Paul show always has Freddie and Paul on the thumbnail. So I put out a lot of videos, and I know I wouldn't have time to watch all of the videos that I produce. And so that's part of why I choose the thumbnails that I do. So thanks for watching. Leave a comment below.